In the middle of a blizzard on a remote Idaho pass, a patrol car lies thrown into a ravine like a shattered toy. Inside, Sheriff Miller is dying, and flames have begun to lick at the leaking gas tank. Everyone will assume it's a tragic accident caused by the weather, but another truth is hidden in the mangled steel. This crash was not random. It was a carefully calculated warning. And what is about to be discovered in that wreckage will not only save a life, but will also uncover a conspiracy that could drown the entire town. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Where are you listening to this story from? The town of Silver Creek, Idaho, was a place that measured time in seasons, not hours. Tucked into the folds of the Rocky Mountains, it held its breath in late autumn, waiting for the inevitable blanket of winter. High above the town, nestled among pine and aspen, Alex, Sully, Sullivan lived in a similar state of quiet waiting. A former Army K-9 handler, Sully was a man in his early 40s, tall and lean with a quiet strength in his frame. His short brown hair was silvering at the temples, and his face, though often shadowed by memories, held a deep-seated kindness. He had come to these mountains seeking silence, a refuge from the noise of a world he no longer felt part of. His only companion was Ghost, a 5-year-old German shepherd whose magnificent coat of slate gray and snow white gave him an ethereal, almost phantom-like appearance. Once a decorated military working dog, Ghost had been retired for the same reason Sully had left the service. The invisible wounds of war had scarred them both. They lived in a comfortable silence, two broken soldiers healing together in the vast, forgiving quiet of the wilderness. Tonight, however, the quiet was a lie. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper all day, began to snarl through the trees. Snowflakes turned from lazy drifters into a blinding horizontal assault. It was the first real blizzard of the season, a violent reminder that nature's peace was always temporary. Inside the small log cabin, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sully sat in a worn armchair, a half-read book resting on his lap, while Ghost dozed at his feet. Suddenly, Ghost's head shot up, his ears erect. A low whine escaped his throat. Sully looked up from his book. "Easy, boy, it's just the wind." But it wasn't. Through the howl of the storm came another sound, faint but sharp, a violent, metallic scream that was swallowed almost instantly by the blizzard. It was the sound of a large vehicle in its death throes. Down on the winding mountain pass, Sheriff Miller's patrol cruiser had just been struck by a heavy, dark truck that appeared out of the swirling snow and vanished just as quickly, leaving the sheriff's vehicle to cartwheel over the guardrail and plunge into the ravine below. Sully felt a familiar cold dread creep up his spine. He had heard sounds like that before, but Ghost's reaction was different. The dog was on his feet now, pacing frantically, his body trembling not with fear, but with a strange and desperate urgency. He ran to the door, scratching at the thick wood and letting out a sharp, commanding bark. He looked back at Sully, his intelligent eyes pleading. It was a look that transcended species, a clear and urgent message. Someone was out there. Someone needed them. Sully hesitated for only a heartbeat, the urgency in Ghost's eyes mirroring a long dormant instinct within himself. The storm raged outside, a white fury intent on burying the world, but the distant scream of metal had cut through the illusion of their isolated peace. He grabbed his thick woolen coat and a pair of sturdy gloves. Ghost was already at the door, his gray and white fur dusted with fresh snow that had somehow found its way inside. Venturing out into the blizzard was like stepping into a sensory void. The wind roared in their ears, and the heavy snow stole visibility, turning familiar landmarks into ghostly shapes. Sully moved with the practiced caution of someone who had navigated far more treacherous landscapes. Ghost stayed close, his powerful body a reassuring presence against Sully's leg, his keen senses undoubtedly picking up nuances in the storm that Sully could not. The journey down the winding mountain road was arduous. Snowdrifts piled high, forcing them to navigate carefully. The air was bitingly cold, and Sully could feel the sting of the wind even through his layers of clothing. Yet Ghost pressed on, his determination a silent encouragement. After what felt like an eternity, they saw it. The mangled wreckage of a vehicle half buried in a snowbank, a plume of white steam rising eerily into the swirling snow. The front end was crumpled beyond recognition, and the acrid smell of gasoline hung heavy in the frigid air. Flames flickered weakly beneath the chassis, a hungry orange glow against the white. Without a word, Ghost sprang into action. He didn't hesitate at the sight of the twisted metal or the imminent danger of fire. With a low growl of determination, he squeezed through a shattered window into the interior of the car. Sully's heart leaped into his throat. "Ghost, be careful," he yelled against the wind, his voice barely audible. Moments stretched into an eternity. Then, a dark shape emerged from the wreckage. Ghost, his teeth gently but firmly gripping the collar of a figure clad in a dark uniform, was dragging the unconscious man out of the burning vehicle. It was Sheriff Miller, his face pale and bloodied, his body limp. Working quickly, Sully checked for a pulse. Faint, but there. His military medical training kicked in. He cleared the sheriff's airway and checked for any obvious bleeding, using his scarf to apply pressure to a gash on Miller's forehead. The cold was a double-edged sword, slowing the spread of blood but also threatening hypothermia. Sully pulled the sheriff further away from the wreck, just as a whoosh of heat and a muffled explosion erupted as the fuel tank ignited. Sully used his body to shield Miller from the wind and snow, his hands moving swiftly and efficiently. Ghost, his mission accomplished, now stood guard, a low rumble emanating from his chest, his gaze fixed on the surrounding wilderness as if anticipating further threat. They waited, huddled together against the storm, until the distant wail of sirens finally broke through the howling wind. As the first responders arrived, their bright lights cutting through the swirling snow, Sully and Ghost melted back into the darkness, their presence unnoticed in the chaos of the rescue. Sheriff Miller woke to the rhythmic, sterile beep of a heart monitor and the smell of antiseptic. A dull ache throbbed in his head, and when he opened his eyes, the white ceiling of the hospital room swam into focus. His memory was a fractured mosaic, full of swirling snow and the horrifying crunch of metal. But through the fog, two images remained with stubborn clarity: a man moving with the quiet competence of a soldier, and a great, wolf-like dog, a gray ghost that seemed to command the storm itself. Beside his bed stood Deputy Eva Rostova, a woman whose sharp intelligence was her most defining feature. In her mid-30s, she had dark, watchful eyes, and her brown hair was pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense braid. She was a city detective before life brought her to the deceptive quiet of Silver Creek, and she never lost her edge. "Welcome back, Sheriff," she said, her voice soft but unable to hide its underlying tension. "You gave us quite a scare." "It wasn't an accident, Eva," Miller rasped, his throat raw. "Someone hit me." Eva's expression hardened. "I know. The 911 call logs from last night were tampered with. The nearest patrol car was rerouted to a phantom call just 2 minutes before your crash. Someone wanted you isolated." A cold fear, unfamiliar to a man like Miller, settled in his chest. He was vulnerable, exposed. He looked at his deputy, his most trusted officer. There was someone else there, a man. He looked like a soldier, and his dog, a gray shepherd. They pulled me out. He gripped her hand, his knuckles white. "Find them, Eva. They're the only ones I can trust right now. Find the soldier and his ghost." Eva's investigation led her up the winding mountain pass to the isolated cabin owned by the town's resident recluse, Alex Sullivan. When she knocked, the door opened a crack. Sully's face was guarded, his eyes holding a familiar weariness she'd seen in other veterans. A large gray and white shepherd stood at his side, its posture a silent warning. "Mr. Sullivan," Eva began, holding up her badge, "I'm Deputy Rostova. We need to talk about last night." "I don't know anything," Sully said flatly, his voice the rusty sound of disuse. He started to close the door. "Sheriff Miller is asking for you," Eva said, her voice firm, stopping the door's movement. "He knows you saved his life. He believes you're the only person he can trust." Sully's resolve wavered. He wanted no part of this. He had come here to escape the world's dangers, not to be dragged back into them. But the earnest plea in the deputy's eyes was hard to ignore. An hour later, he found himself standing awkwardly in the sterile hospital room. Ghost waited outside with a junior officer, having refused to be left behind. Sheriff Miller looked small and frail against the white sheets, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Sully, a look of profound gratitude and desperate appeal. In that moment, Sully knew his peaceful isolation was over. The arrangement was temporary and unsettling. Sully and Ghost moved into a small, county-owned guest house, a few hundred yards from Sheriff Miller's home at the edge of town. The transition from the profound silence of their mountain cabin to the muted but constant hum of civilization set Sully on edge. Here, every distant car door, every barking neighborhood dog was a potential threat. Ghost seemed to feel it too, his usual calm replaced with a quiet, coiled vigilance. He spent most of his time at the window, his gray and white form, a stoic sentinel watching over the sheriff's house. 2 days after Sully's hospital visit, Deputy Rostova arrived with a cardboard box. "Personal effects from the wreck," she explained, setting it on the small kitchen table. "We've processed everything. There's not much left, but the sheriff wanted you to have a look." The box contained the mundane debris of a life interrupted: a wallet with a cracked photo of Miller's late wife, a set of keys, a half-eaten bag of trail mix. Sully sifted through the items with a detached sadness. Ghost, however, showed no interest in the objects that smelled most strongly of the sheriff. Instead, his attention was completely fixed on one item: a worn, black leather planner that looked at least a decade old. While Sully and Eva discussed the case, Ghost padded over to the table. He ignored everything else, nudging the planner with his wet nose. When it didn't move, he whined, softly. A low, insistent sound. "Ghost, leave it," Sully said. But the dog persisted. He placed a large paw on the book, pinning it to the table and looking directly at Sully. His gaze was unwavering, intense. It was the same look he used to give in the field when he'd found a hidden explosive device. Eva watched, intrigued. "What is it?" "I don't know," Sully admitted. But he trusted that look more than he trusted his own eyes. He picked up the planner. It felt ordinary. The pages were filled with old appointments and scribbled notes. But Ghost wouldn't relent. He nudged Sully's hand again, his nose pressing against the back cover. Sully ran his thumb along the worn leather, following the dog's lead. He felt it then, a subtle ridge near the spine, a seam that was almost imperceptible. His heart quickened. Using his thumbnail, he carefully worked at the seam. The leather peeled back, revealing a small, hollowed-out compartment, perfectly carved into the thick cardboard backing. And nestled inside was a single, old-fashioned brass key, tarnished with age and attached to no ring. It was a key that belonged to a lock from another era, a key that had no business being hidden in the sheriff's old planner. It was the first tangible piece of a puzzle they didn't yet understand, a secret that smelled, to a dog like Ghost, like a lie. The strange brass key became the focal point of their quiet, tense investigation. While Sully stayed close to the recovering sheriff, Eva took the key to the Silver Creek Town Hall. She spoke with a clerk who had worked there for 40 years, a woman whose memory was its own kind of archive. The clerk's eyes lit up with faint recognition. She led Eva down a flight of creaking wooden stairs into the courthouse basement, a place that smelled of damp stone and forgotten time. At the end of a long, dark corridor was a heavy oak door with a tarnished brass lock and a faded sign that read, "Municipal Archive, sealed 1985. The key fit perfectly. The air that greeted them upon opening the door was thick and stale, heavy with the dust of 4 decades. Rows upon rows of identical gray metal boxes stretched from floor to ceiling, filling the vast room. There had to be thousands of them, each one a silent tomb of paper and ink. An overwhelming sense of hopelessness washed over Eva. "We'll never find what we're looking for in here," she whispered, the dust motes dancing in the beam of her flashlight. "It would take months." "We won't have to," Sully said quietly. He had insisted on coming, and Ghost stood at his side, his body alert. "Let him work." Sully gave a quiet command, a single word from their shared past. Ghost immediately understood. This was not a walk, this was a search. The dog began to move through the aisles, not with random sniffing, but with the systematic precision of a trained professional. He worked in a grid pattern, his nose held low, his tail straight. He ignored the vast majority of the boxes, dismissing them with a passing sniff. He was searching for a specific scent, an anomaly in the monotonous landscape of decay. After nearly 20 minutes of methodical searching, Ghost stopped. He halted in the center of a long aisle, turned, and sat squarely in front of one specific metal box on a low shelf. He didn't bark or scratch. He simply sat, his body rigid, and looked back at Sully. The signal was unmistakable. This was it. Sully and Eva exchanged a look of disbelief and awe. They pulled the heavy box from the shelf and carried it to a dusty table. The latch was stiff, but it gave way with a protesting groan. Inside, there were no loose files. Instead, the box was filled with large, rolled-up plat maps tied with faded ribbon, and several thick, leather-bound ledgers. They carefully unrolled the first map. It was the original survey of Silver Creek County, dated 1928. With trembling fingers, Eva traced the lines with her flashlight beam, her breath catching in her throat. The land that Marcus Thorne, the town's most powerful developer, was aggressively campaigning to build his luxury resort on. The land he claimed was a worthless tract of forgotten municipal property, was clearly and unequivocally marked. It was designated as Protected National Forest, its boundaries inviolable. The contracts and deeds in the ledgers confirmed it. The documents in this box, a box forgotten by time but found by a dog's incredible senses, were the foundation of a very old, very inconvenient truth. The discovery in the archive room changed everything. The yellowed maps and brittle deeds were no longer just historical documents. They were evidence. Eva secured them in the sheriff department's evidence locker, while Sully returned to his own cabin on the mountain, needing a moment of solitude to process the danger they had just unearthed. News, however, traveled fast in a town like Silver Creek, and a leak from the town hall was inevitable. They had rattled the cage of a very powerful man, Marcus Thorne, and a response was not just likely, it was certain. It came that night. Sully was woken from a light, restless sleep, not by a loud noise, but by a sudden, unnatural silence. The usual chorus of crickets had stopped. Ghost was already on his feet, standing at the door, a low, guttural growl rumbling deep in his chest. Sully grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and moved silently to the window. Two shadowy figures were moving near the small, empty woodshed at the edge of his property. They moved with a swift, destructive purpose, smashing the door and overturning a stack of firewood before one of them spray-painted a single word on the cabin wall: "Leave." Then they melted back into the forest. The violation of his sanctuary, the one place on earth he felt safe, was a key that unlocked the darkest rooms of his mind. The scent of the spray paint mixed with the memory of diesel and cordite. The snap of a twig under the intruder's feet became the crack of a distant rifle. The four walls of his cabin began to close in, the air growing thick and heavy. He was no longer in Idaho. He was back in the suffocating heat of the desert, the sounds of chaos echoing in his ears. His breath came in ragged gasps, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin as the panic attack took hold. He slid down the wall, his head in his hands, completely lost in the flashback. Ghost, however, did not bark at the intruders or cower in fear. He seemed to recognize the true enemy was not outside, but within the room. He moved to Sully's side, pressing his solid, warm body against his trembling legs. he whined softly, a sound of profound concern, and nudged his wet nose under Sully's hand. When Sully didn't respond, Ghost rested his heavy head on his lap, a grounding, living anchor in the swirling storm of memory. Slowly, the weight and warmth of the dog pulled Sully back to the present. The imagined sounds of the desert faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of Ghost's breathing and the feel of his thick fur. Sully's own breathing began to slow, his gaze focusing on the loyal, worried eyes of his partner. In that moment, as he stroked Ghost's head, the fear receded and was replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. They had not just threatened him, they had threatened his home, his peace, his dog. He realized then that this fight was no longer just about helping the sheriff. Protecting the town from men like Thorne was now intrinsically linked to protecting his own hard-won peace. It was a path to justice, and perhaps the only true path to healing himself. The morning after the intrusion, a cold resolve had settled over Sully. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now fuel. He needed to clear his head, to escape the lingering taint of the violation and return to a place where the rules were simple and honest. He decided to take Ghost for a long walk, not just for relaxation but as an act of defiance. They drove to the edge of the Silver Creek National Forest, the very land Marcus Thorne coveted, and stepped out into the crisp, clean air. For the first hour, it was perfect. They followed a familiar, winding trail, the silence broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on fallen leaves and the whisper of the wind in the high pines. Ghost trotted ahead, his tail held high, a picture of canine contentment. He chased squirrels, sniffed at badger holes, and for a little while he was not a retired war dog, but just a dog. Sully felt the tension in his own shoulders begin to ease. Here, in the vastness of the woods, the world felt sane again. Then, everything changed. In the middle of the path, Ghost froze. His head lifted, his nostrils flared, and his entire body went rigid. A scent, faint and foreign, had drifted on the breeze. It was not the scent of pine or earth or any wild animal. It was the scent of man, where no man should be. Before Sully could react, Ghost veered sharply off the trail, plunging into the dense, untracked undergrowth with a singular, urgent purpose. "Ghost, wait!" Sully called, but it was useless. He pushed through tangled branches and thick brush, following the fleeting image of gray and white fur. The chase led them deeper and deeper into the forest, to a part of the woods that was wild and forgotten. Finally, they burst into a small, unnatural clearing. The space felt wrong. The ground was trampled, and small, brightly colored plastic flags were tied to several trees. There were impressions in the soft earth where heavy equipment had recently rested. It was a survey site, an illegal one, hastily abandoned. Sully's eyes scanned the area, noting the signs of a professional operation trying to hide its tracks. While Sully processed the scene, Ghost began to dig frantically at a patch of disturbed earth near the base of a large spruce tree. Clumps of dirt and pine needles flew into the air as he worked. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" Sully knelt beside him. Ghost pulled back, revealing a dark object half buried in the soil. Sully reached in and pulled it free. It was a man's leather wallet, damp and muddy. He flipped it open. Inside, behind a clear plastic window, was a driver's license and a corporate identification card. The face on the card was unfamiliar, but the logo printed in the top corner made Sully's blood run cold. It was the stylized mountain peak emblem of the Thorne Development Corporation. This wasn't just a hunch anymore. This was a physical link, a piece of concrete evidence, dug from the earth by a dog who could smell a lie from a mile away. Sully didn't hesitate. He brought the muddy wallet straight to Eva, placing it on her desk like a trophy from a grim hunt. The ID card from Thorne's corporation was all the probable cause she needed. Within hours, she had a signed warrant from a judge, and by evening, she was buried under a mountain of financial records from Thorne's office. The small sheriff's department office was lit by the cold glow of her computer monitor, the walls covered in a growing web of sticky notes connecting names, dates, and amounts. Ghost lay quietly under the desk, a silent, furry anchor in the storm of information. The picture that emerged was uglier than she could have imagined. Marcus Thorne was a master of misdirection. He had created a series of shell companies, ghost corporations, with no assets and no employees, registered in other states. Public funds meant for town improvements were funneled into these companies for phantom services, then rerouted as political donations or consulting fees to key town officials who were pushing for the land to be rezoned. It was a complex, tangled web of bribery and money laundering, designed to make the theft of public land look like a legitimate enterprise. Eva felt a cold anger as she traced the flow of money, seeing the betrayal of public trust laid bare in spreadsheets and bank statements. While Eva followed the money trail, Sully focused on the other items from the wallet. Tucked into a side pocket was a small folded piece of paper, a topographical map of a section of the mountain. There was also a small, spiral-bound notebook filled with handwritten calculations and cryptic notes, references to drilling depths, soil density, and something that made his blood run cold, a list of items that included blasting caps and emulsion explosives. His military experience wasn't limited to handling dogs. It included demolitions and terrain analysis. The numbers and symbols weren't just abstract notes, they were a plan. Spreading the small map out next to the original county survey they had found in the archive, he began to cross-reference the coordinates. His finger traced the planned drilling locations. They were all clustered along one specific ridge. A ridge he knew from his own time in these mountains, a ridge known locally for its geological instability. It sat directly above the valley where Silver Creek was nestled. The horrifying truth slammed into him. Thorne wasn't just planning to clear a few trees. He was planning to use explosives to reshape the mountainside, to blast away a portion of the ridge to create the perfect, dramatic foundation for his resort. He was doing this with a blatant disregard for the risk, for the fact that a major detonation along that unstable fault line could trigger a landslide of catastrophic proportions. He grabbed his phone and dialed Eva's number. "Eva, it's not just about the money," he said, his voice low and urgent the moment she answered. "The notes in that wallet, they're plans for a demolition. They're going to use explosives on the North Ridge." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, then Eva's sharp intake of breath. "The fault line," she whispered, the pieces clicking into place. "They're not just trying to steal the land," Sully finished, his voice grim. "They're willing to bury the town to get it." The realization that Thorne was planning a potential catastrophe sent a shockwave through their small group. They had to move fast. But Thorne, feeling the walls closing in, was faster. His next move was one of pure desperation. That afternoon, Deputy Eva Rostova disappeared while walking to her car. A short time later, a call came through to Sheriff Miller's personal phone. The voice was smooth, but laced with a frantic edge. It was Marcus Thorne. He had Eva. He wanted all the evidence, the original maps, the ledgers, the wallet, everything. The exchange would happen at midnight, at the old abandoned hydroelectric dam north of town, and they were to come alone. The dam was a skeletal giant of concrete and rusted steel, a monument to forgotten industry silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Sheriff Miller, against doctor's orders, was there, his face grim and determined. Sully pulled up in his old truck, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. In the covered bed of the truck, hidden beneath a pile of canvas tarps, lay Ghost, perfectly still and silent, awaiting his command. Marcus Thorne stood in the center of the dam, illuminated by the headlights of his own SUV. He was a man who usually wore expensive suits like a second skin, but tonight his tailored coat was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes held the wild glint of a cornered animal. A burly man with a flat, expressionless face held Eva firmly by the arm, her jaw set in defiance. "The evidence," Thorne demanded, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "Put it on the ground and kick it over." Sully placed the evidence box on the concrete, his mind racing. He saw the flicker of fear in Eva's eyes, the overconfidence in Thorne's. He needed a diversion, a moment of chaos. He caught Eva's gaze and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only signal he could risk. Then he uttered a single low word into the cold night air. "Watch. Watch." It was a release command. From the back of Sully's truck, a silent gray and white blur erupted from beneath the tarps. Ghost launched himself over the side of the truck bed, his paws making no sound on the pavement as he sprinted across the dam. He was not a barking, snarling beast, but a silent, focused weapon, a true ghost in the night. The henchman holding Eva didn't even see him coming until it was too late. Ghost hit him low and hard, a 90-pound missile of muscle and teeth that knocked the man off his feet and sent him sprawling. In that split second of chaos, Sully moved. He lunged forward, not at Thorne, but at Eva, pulling her clear of the struggle. At the same time, Sheriff Miller, surprisingly quick, drew his service weapon. Thorne, his face a mask of shock and fury, made a desperate grab for Eva, but Sully was already there. Using a swift, practiced move from his army training, he twisted Thorne's arm behind his back and forced him to the ground. The fight was over as quickly as it began. Thorne lay pinned beneath Sully, his blustering rage deflated into pathetic whimpers. The henchman was nursing a bleeding arm, with Ghost standing over him, not attacking, but simply holding him in place with a low, menacing growl that promised severe consequences for any sudden movement. Eva was safe. As the distant sound of approaching sirens grew louder, Ghost stood his ground, a disciplined guardian watching over the defeated villain, his duty done. The arrest of Marcus Thorne and his co-conspirators sent a tremor through the quiet life of Silver Creek, but it was a cleansing one. The web of corruption, so carefully woven in the shadows, unraveled completely under the stark light of federal investigation. The town, saved from a disaster it never knew was coming, began to heal. The failed plot to destroy the mountain became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the town diner. Spring arrived that year with a gentle but persistent hope, melting the heavy snow and coaxing green life from the dormant earth. It mirrored the change in Sully. The shadows in his eyes had receded, replaced by a quiet confidence. The peace he had sought in isolation, he had instead found in action, in purpose. One bright April afternoon, Sheriff Miller, now fully recovered and walking without a limp, drove up to Sully's cabin. He found the veteran repairing the woodshed that had been vandalized months before, with Ghost lying contentedly in a patch of sun nearby. They didn't speak of the dam or the investigation. They spoke of the changing seasons and the resilience of the town. "Eva and I were talking," Miller said, leaning against the railing of the porch. "This town was lucky. We were unprepared. I want to start a K-9 unit for the department, a proper one. And there's only one man I'd trust to build it from the ground up." Sully stopped his work, looking at the sheriff, then down at Ghost, his partner, his savior, the dog who had pulled him from the darkness in more ways than one. He saw the path forward, clear and bright. It wasn't a retreat into the mountains, but a step down into the community. It was a chance to use the skills forged in the crucible of war to protect the peace. "We'd be honored, Sheriff," Sully said, and for the first time in a long time, his smile reached his eyes. The following summer, the field behind the Silver Creek Sheriff's Department was filled with the sound of happy barking. Sully, no longer a gaunt recluse in worn clothes, stood in the center of the field, wearing the uniform of a departmental trainer. He was calm, focused, and instructing a young deputy on how to handle a boisterous chocolate Labrador puppy. Ghost was there too, off to the side, lying under the shade of a large oak tree. He was not a trainee, but a mentor, a respected veteran, observing the next generation. He watched the puppies tumble and play, his gaze serene and knowing. He had faced down explosions and assassins, had walked through the valley of his master's darkest memories, and had emerged on the other side. Sully glanced over at his old friend, and their eyes met across the field. a silent understanding passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of the long road they had traveled. They were no longer ghosts haunted by the past, but guardians of the future. Here, in the warm summer sun, surrounded by the sounds of new life and new purpose, the two old soldiers had finally, truly, come home. The journey of Sully and Ghost reminds us that the greatest healing often comes not from forgetting our scars, but from finding a new purpose that makes the future worth fighting for. It shows that the quiet loyalty of a true friend can be the anchor that pulls us back from any storm. If stories like this touch your heart, we hope you'll consider joining our community and sharing your thoughts below. You never know who might need to hear this message of hope today. Our storytelling journey continues, and the next chapter is waiting for you in the video now appearing on your screen.